Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the latest webinar in our client experience series. Thank you for joining us today to hear about COP28 and what in-house legal teams need to know. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Stephen Shergold, and I'm chair of our Global ESG Leadership Group. And I very much look forward to hosting you today and taking you through the various elements that we're going to share with you as part of getting ready for COP28 that starts in a couple of weeks' time in Dubai. If you are looking at the moment for press on COP28, like I am, you may have noticed the same thing that I've noticed, which is it's rather quiet out there. Normally by this stage, there is quite a lot of momentum going into a COP. And indeed, I looked at the FT this morning and there was an article on climate finance, and we're going to talk about climate finance in a minute. But the article concluded with the rather muted tone of, but we don't expect much progress on this at COP28. And you may well get that vibe from the presentations today, that we are in a world that is catering with a lot of different issues at the moment, and the progress that we might make at COP28 might not be as ambitious as what the world needs, because we all sit here today and we all know that climate change is continuing, the impacts on people and planet and on the finances of our companies is increasing week by week, month by month. So action needs to be taken. But the chances of great strides being taken politically, globally at COP28 may well be a little bit less than we would hope for at this stage. However, that doesn't mean that this is a risk that GCs and legal teams can therefore put on the back burner. In fact, what I would like to do during the course of the session today is hear from all of our panel of experts, and then actually just draw that together for you at the end and ask ourselves the question: does this picture paint one that is of less legal risk for GCs to consider, or indeed is it a picture that creates more legal risk for companies? So that's the essence of today. Now, do ask us questions, put them in the chat box if you have any as we go along. We'll try to save a bit of time at the end for those questions. But briefly, let me just give you an overview of how we're going to work through today's session. So on the next slide, we have got the leaders that are going to be talking with you today. I'm going to introduce all of them very briefly and let them say a couple of words about themselves and their background. So firstly, I'd like to introduce you to former US Ambassador Phil Reker. Phil, please could you share a couple of thoughts with today's guests?
Stephen, thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you. I am Ambassador Phil Reker. I was with the United States State Department, a career diplomat for over 31 years, until I joined as a partner at Dentons Global Advisors earlier this year, heading the Europe practice at the Albright Stonebridge Group in Washington. I was the Assistant Secretary of State for Europe and Eurasia under both Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and Tony Blinken, until Secretary Blinken sent me to London in 2021 as the interim ambassador to the United Kingdom. Obviously, at that time, working very closely with John Kerry, the Special Presidential Envoy for Climate, as we prepared to host COP26 in Glasgow. Look forward to giving you a little more overview in a minute. Over to Melissa.
Thank you, Ambassador. I'm Melissa Coppolo. I am currently also with Dentons Global Advisors. I lead the sustainability practice at the Albright Stonebridge Group. I also started my career at the State Department. I was there for more than 15 years doing a variety of things, including leading the U.S. negotiations on the UN Sustainable Development Goals. I then left and went to Anheuser-Busch InBev, where I aligned the company to the UN SDGs and built out public-private partnerships within the UN system, and then now moved over here where I've been for 2.5 years. In these various different roles, I have been attending COP, as a member of U.S. delegations, along with the CEO from Anheuser-Busch InBev, and I've been to the last two COPs with Albright Stonebridge Group. So I am well-versed on COP world and looking forward to sharing some insights with you all.
Thank you, Mel. And now I'd like to introduce my partner in Oman, Yasser Taki. Yasser, would you like to just introduce yourself to everyone?
Thank you, Stephen. Good day, everybody, and thank you for taking the time to join our webinar today. I am a partner in the Energy and Projects Group based out in the Middle East, and sort of as a team, we cover the MENA region generally, and our practice area sort of is quite broad. So we advise public sector bodies, private sector players, as well as NGOs on matters that include regulatory and policy reform, developments of projects, including kind of renewables and energy transition matters. I'll hand over to Adam perhaps now.
Hi, thanks, Yasser. Good afternoon or good morning, or wherever you are. I'm Adam Brown. I'm a lawyer in our energy team here in London, and I've spent a lot of my career both at Dentons and elsewhere advising the UK government.
Thank you, Adam. And then Vivian Chu, who is the partner who leads our ESG Sustainable Finance group based out of Hong Kong. Vivian, over to you.
Yes, hi. Hello, everyone. I have been advising on financial markets, financial institutions, asset managers, and investment funds all of my career. And 5 years ago, specifically kind of started integrating advising on ESG issues and impact in my practice. And so, as Stephen mentioned, I lead sustainable finance within Dentons, and really happy to be here to discuss climate finance with you all today. Thank you.
Thank you, Vivian. So if we just look at what we're going to cover over the course of the session, we're going to look at the geopolitical landscape, because it's impossible to think about COP28 or decarbonisation right now without understanding that broader picture. Then we're going to look at the COP28 themes so that we order our thinking in terms of what the meeting will be considering over the course of that first fortnight in December. We will then have a perspective from the Middle East, Dubai hosting a COP, and Yasser will give us some perspectives on what this feels like locally, before moving on to taking a deep dive into two of the core areas of discussion and areas that need international collaboration: energy transition and climate finance. And then, of course, we'll draw it together at the end by, really thinking about what this means for GCs and legal teams. So just to make sure that we give this the emphasis that you're looking for, Niamh, I think you have a short poll that we're going to run very quickly at this stage.
Yes, we'd love to know as you step into today's webinar where your focus is and how you'd like us to, I suppose, if you like, focus the topics today. So I can already see lots of people getting involved in sharing their view with us. So we'll just give everyone an opportunity to vote on where they would like to see the discussion today. So is it the geopolitical context? Perhaps it's the themes for business. Maybe you're keen to hear Yasser's Middle East perspective. It might be energy transition or climate finance. And we'll just do a 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 on this one, and we'll share the results with you all.
Okay, thank you, Niamh. Okay, so obviously, quite a large focus on just understanding those themes for business, and in fact, pitching that in a geopolitical landscape. Two of those themes are energy transition and climate finance, so that will hopefully speak to the overall desire for people to learn more about what's going to happen at COP as well. So thank you. What I will do now is get things moving by handing over to Phil.
Stephen, thank you. And I'm speaking to you all today from the campus of Yale University in New Haven, Connecticut. The fact that I can sit outside on a day like this in November in New England does remind us that COP and its agenda is rather important, I think, for all of us on the planet. But 2 years ago, as I mentioned, I was welcoming President Biden to Glasgow for COP26 in my capacity as his ambassador in the United Kingdom. At the time, the pressure for climate action, I think, was peaking. The need for the 1.5 degrees centigrade to remain the limit for warming seemed to be in reach. I have to say that while it was much colder on the tarmac there in Scotland, and COP26 was considered a broad success, geopolitics has intervened in the last 2 years. And 2 years later, the world is in many ways a drastically different place. The international focus has continued to shift away from the climate debate, as Stephen indicated. The disruptors that you can see on the slide have intervened, often pushing the climate priorities out. Russia's ongoing and brutal war against Ukraine, something people thought impossible at this stage in human history, a land war of this capacity, this size in Europe, is continuing to drive debate about energy resources, resilience, reliance on Russian oil and gas, the need for renewables, pushing some countries, of course, to abandon their climate goals to ensure that their homes are heated as we head into a second winter of this war. Other factors like the Middle East have entered in, even to push Ukraine out of the headlines. Some have suggested that we're dealing with a geopolitical environment unlike anything we've seen in almost a century, in terms of the various crises points around the world. President Biden has just met with Chinese President Xi outside San Francisco. We'll be looking for further news there, while the issues related to China continue to be major ones. The U.S., under President Biden, of course, passed one of the most ambitious climate action legislation packages in history, the Inflation Reduction Act, as well as various infrastructure legislations have committed funding to focus on green energy. But the competition with China and these other factors are creating great challenges. If we move to the next slide, we're reminded that COP is a gathering of global leaders. Geopolitics is very much in the air, and it very much will be again as we move into 2024. 2024 will be the year of elections. And while democracy is challenged and challenging all around the world, over half of the world's GDP, i.e. the countries that have produced more than half of global GDP, are going to the polls in 2024. The US elections incredibly important for which direction things go in terms of the climate agenda, as well as many other factors. The UK expected to have elections before the end of the year. The EU will have parliamentary elections, and from that choose a new European Commission, which can affect policy direction. Will it lean further to the right, or as we saw in Poland, pulling back from the right to more centrist policies? Russia even has elections, although I can predict the outcome of those elections. India, most populous country in the world, increasingly important economically and on the climate agenda, chairing the G20, also elections. Egypt, Indonesia, Mexico. So this proves to be an important year coming up, and the context of that is going to be very important as general counsels advise their C-suites. And that, of course, is what we're doing at DGA, providing that geopolitical insight and strategy as you move ahead. Let me hand it over to Mel.
Thank you, Ambassador. Before I get into the main themes that I see coming, I just want to kind of level set here and talk very, very briefly about some paradigm shifts that we're seeing from COP27 to COP28 that will really be underpinning the themes. The first is that we're moving from talk to really fast tracking the energy transition and commitments and slashing emissions before 2030. We're also transforming climate finance by delivering on old promises and setting the framework for a new deal on finance. This shift is really moving because Stephen mentioned at the very beginning, the one article he saw was about the climate finance. It's going to take center stage. We're also putting nature, communities, lives, and livelihoods squarely in the center of climate action with a noticeable nod to climate justice that we'll see come out probably much more fulsome in COP28. And then we're also mobilizing for the most inclusive COP ever. For the first time, the UN Climate Summit will feature a local climate action summit. It's going to include hundreds of subnational leaders like mayors, governors, business executives, and NGO representatives, with a focus on how they can better coordinate climate action with national governments. So how do these really feed into what I'm seeing as the key themes for COP28? The first theme is really around the global stocktake, which I'm sure you're hearing plenty about. It's getting lots of headline news, or where there's news, it's getting some attention. The global stocktake is a critical component of the Paris Agreement framework, and it was designed to take place every 5 years to spur increasingly ambitious climate action and motivate the next round of national climate commitments. But the reality check for multi-sector stakeholders is that we're not keeping the 1.5 alive. And that's a notable tone shift from COP27 to COP28. But part of the shift in the stocktake process has now moved from the technical phase to a political one that we're going to see culminate in Dubai and will likely be the headline outcome. Where you can make sure to pay attention is that we expect a major focus in this global stocktake conversation to be in sectors and systems such as energy, transport, food systems, and land use. Then there is the issue of fossil fuel phase out. The COP26 final outcome included a call to phase down unabated coal power. At COP27, more than 80 countries indicated support to phase down all fossil fuels. This year, many countries have made reaching an agreement to phase out all fossil fuels a central goal in the negotiations. China, India, and Russia habitually oppose coal technology phase outs and ending fossil fuel subsidies. The US regularly hesitates when supporting a full stop end to the use of fossil fuels, whereas the EU remains firm in its determination to end fossil fuel subsidies. At COP28, the UAE is expected to announce a commitment from at least 20 major oil and gas companies to reduce methane leakage and reach net zero emissions by 2050, but only for their own operations, not for the fuel they sell or the so-called Scope 3 emissions, which is likely to be seen as sidestepping the real issue. During the recent meeting between President Xi and President Biden, China and the United States agreed to reduce planet warming emissions from the power sector this decade and committed for the first time to curb all greenhouse gases. However, there was no firm commitments to rapidly transition away from fossil fuels this decade and no discussion of coal phase-outs. So it is unclear how these recent agreements will play out in Dubai. Moving on to what I'm looking at as the third of the themes for COP28, the ongoing geopolitical debate surrounding the concept of unabated in the context of carbon capture and storage technologies remains a pressing issue. Countries are poised to exploit the ambiguity around the phase out or phase down terminologies as both a solution and also as an excuse to perpetuate fossil fuel usage. Regardless of the phrasing negotiators ultimately land on, the importance of carbon capture technology will remain, but we can expect the negotiators will want to make sure its use is limited and focused only on those applications where it is most needed. The UAE, in its role as COP28 president, is likely to be an advocate for such green transition strategies and technologies. Then there's the issue of climate finance. 2 years ago at COP26, countries agreed to at least double climate finance from 2019 levels by 2025. Yet we have seen funding for climate goals threatened and slashed worldwide since COP27. Mobilizations of funds continue to hit roadblocks, and there's a lack of clear path towards appropriate funds for COP28 goals and beyond. We can expect to see important discussions on how the private sector can expand adaptation finance. Closely tied to this issue is the issue of loss and damage fund. While the creation of the fund reached agreement at COP27, which was a historic achievement 30 years in the making, the rubber has not yet met the road, as a key task for COP28 will be to determine how to operationalize it. While the scope of the fund was determined in Egypt, who would fund it remains unclear. The final working session early this month saw the World Bank as a temporary host of the fund, but the decision has met with reservations from developing countries. The last of the top 5 topics I'm seeing is the issue of technology. The US, EU, China competition will significantly color the technology transfer, capacity building, and IP rights conversations at the upcoming COP. Although the new channel of communication between President Xi and Biden may ease some of these tensions and allow for productive conversations, this focus will undoubtedly bleed into the debates around critical minerals, in particular with their environmental impact and AI. It is this dynamic likely to impact conversations around just transition. The private sector needs to pay particular attention to these debates, as it requires detailed understanding of the nuance to ensure industry is fully aware of the full array of issues around these topics when making decisions, such as EU's investigation into Chinese solar panels and US restrictions on critical minerals and EVs. There will definitely be other things talked about, but again, these are what we're seeing as the top 5 themes to pay attention to.
Thank you.
Now I'd like to turn over.
Thanks, Mel. So now we've given you the sort of the geopolitical setting and the key themes that are going to be discussed at COP. Let's start going into things in a bit more detail, and firstly regionally, and ask Yasser to give us a bit of a view from the Middle East.
Thank you, Mel and Stephen. So I think I'm going to spend the next few minutes, everyone, just talking about what COP28 sort of means for the region, and where are we likely to see sort of the activities and most sort of focus of not only the government but the private sector in. If you can go to the next slide, please. Sort of just setting that against the backdrop and against where we are today. As Mel mentioned, this is sort of a stock take year. This is where governments are going to report on their progress, and indeed they've started reporting on their progress and how they fared against the goals set and the commitments made at the time of signing the Paris Agreement. And I think you've heard from Steve and my colleagues that there's still a lot of work to do to achieve those goals. But as COP comes to the MENA region for a second time in as many years, we can see, looking at the reports submitted by governments, their net zero strategies, hydrogen and energy transition strategies, that there's a renewed focus and increased commitment on doing more to achieve those goals. I think a theme that comes across very clearly from reviewing those strategy documents and reports is that more than ever, the governments realize that private sector engagement and involvement is front and center to all of this. And it's sort of one of the reasons kind of there is a local summit, as if you'd like. It comes very clear, speaking sort of to government people in government circles, but also looking at the material out there and reading between the lines, that the governments are trying to encourage private sector engagement and participation through one of 2 main ways. One is creating wholly new opportunities or markets for in the region for the private sector to invest in, and then secondly, kind of facilitating climate action through change in regulation. And if we were to think of sort of private sector on a spectrum, which my colleague Adam will speak about in a bit more detail, but if we imagine that on that spectrum, at one end of that spectrum, we have kind of the early movers, those who would do as much would take as much climate action as reasonably practicable without much prompt. And then on the other end, we'd see those who kind of would only really take any if penalized, so unless they absolutely have to. What we're seeing is that those on the kind of proactive end of the spectrum are starting to see the fruits of their positioning. They're starting kind of to see the gains of those, whereas those on the opposite of the spectrum are starting to wonder whether they're about to miss the boat. What I'm going to do kind of in the next few minutes is focus on 3 areas where we suspect and where we expect sort of there to be the most opportunity and the most push by governments and the most promotion. The first of those is the fast tracking of renewable energy. So in only sort of 3 or 4 countries are those that make the MENA region. There's more than 6 gigawatts of renewable energy being procured, and there's more planned over the next few years. And that creates sort of a set of opportunity, because the usual suspects have been working in the region, whether we're talking developers, EPC contractors, consultants, and others across the value chain, are reaching kind of the peak of their desirable exposure to the region, and therefore kind of are contemplating sort of, if you like, scaling back. But flipping the coin, regulators and procurers are also sort of realizing that those usual suspects are reaching kind of the higher end of market concentration restrictions, which means kind of that those with little or no exposure to the region suddenly kind of have a window of opportunity and a more sort of level playing field compared to early movers. And I think kind of the second thing coming out of it is we see sort of governments focusing not only on developing those renewable resources, but everything connected to it. So carbon credits and trading of those certificates and credits is going to become something prominent in years to come. We can see the UAE sort of has recently set up the world's first regulated kind of exchange for trading carbon credits. Oman and Saudi are both going kind of through their first rounds of auctions. And you know, given the amount of renewable power sort of coming in those regions, there's only going to be more of those credits kind of being traded or on the market, and that sort of comes with its own opportunity, of course. If we can move to the next slide, please. A second sort of area where we see quite a lot of movement and activity is the growing green hydrogen economy. And we can see that countries sort of from Morocco all the way to the edge of the Arabian Peninsula in Oman, we can see sort of governments very actively signing up hydrogen projects that are designed to produce millions of tons of green ammonia or green hydrogen by or around 2030. And kind of connected to that is a push to really find avenues for that hydrogen and for ammonia to be used. We can see sort of a focus on creating a landscape, whether using carrots or sticks, to promote offtake avenues to downstream capabilities for all that hydrogen and ammonia. So that in itself kind of creates opportunities for off-takers and traders, for example, who by engaging early with developers are likely, and what we're seeing kind of are likely to get more favorable terms from negotiating those offtake agreements. Money managers, fund managers who've got ESG criteria to comply with are sort of what we're seeing are looking and finding opportunities to invest in sort of ESG friendly projects through those avenues. I think lastly, kind of even for businesses that are not into the upstream development of the hydrogen kind of projects themselves, there's plenty of opportunity for everything around it, from kind of industries that are looking to use the green ammonia and hydrogen. And we've seen sort of green steel projects, green cement projects kind of starting, the infrastructures that comes with that. I think the thing to hang on to is that governments are going to either force existing sort of industries to retrofit so that they're able to use all that, or they're going to grant, and they are granting concessions to businesses who are coming in and setting themselves up to use all that hydrogen and ammonia. I think the last point I want to touch on very quickly, is I'm realizing I'm running out of time, is carbon capture. And that sort of goes back to one of the main themes that Mel commented on. Now carbon capture and use has been in the region for quite some time, through in the sense that it's been used for enhanced oil recovery. But we can see that governments are taking it up a notch or two. So out of the moment, in the 6 countries that make the GCC, there's 13 CCUS projects at different degrees of development or stages of development. The most notable of which is probably the Abu Dhabi, the ADNOC sponsored project with a 1.5 million tons of CO2 capacity per year. We see Oman and Saudi have started sort of working groups where industry leaders have been invited to work hand in hand with the government to come up with a regulatory framework designed to incentivize investments in CCUS technology and projects in the region. So I think kind of, again, looking at what that means sort of for businesses. So early movers, going back onto the spectrum, early movers have and will continue to have a real opportunity to shape and influence what regulations will look like and what the investment landscape will be like. We know for a fact that abatement capture regulations are being tested and piloted in various places in the region. So it's I think it'll be very important for businesses to see how we position ourselves kind of to make the most of that, not to be caught up by that. But I think the real opportunity is for those who have solutions to come and pitch those here, or to utilize kind of their expertise as governments continue to rule those regulations. I think I've got over time, so I'm going to have to kind of cut it a bit short, but in the hope that I've given you a flavor of kind of what COP sort of means to the region, where we're likely to see most sort of activity and most focus over the next couple of years or so. And if there are any questions, again, please do pop them in the chat, or you know, we can engage a bit later and address those. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yasser. And of course, the three themes that you've pulled out there for the region are great segues for Adam to talk about more generally the energy transition that really sits at the heart of decarbonisation and addressing greenhouse gas emissions. So Adam, over to you.
Okay, thank you. So we've had the global overview, we've had the regional perspective. I'm going to talk about things very much at a business level. And unless your business is very unusual, greenhouse gas emissions from fossil fuel use are embedded in everything that it buys or sells. And energy transition is the process by which, over a generation, your operations and those of your suppliers are going to switch away from current fossil fuel technologies and towards alternatives that don't emit greenhouse gases. If you think about that for a moment, it's huge. But without energy transition, we're going to have human misery, political chaos, and corporate value destruction on a global scale. So the premise of this slide is that every business on this call has a climate change plan, whether you know it or not. Now, ideally, that means a fully costed pathway for eliminating your scope 1 to 3 greenhouse gas emissions and responding to the impacts of climate change. It would be signed off by the board, it's had input from all parts of the business, and it takes into account a wide range of variables. Now, if your organization doesn't have that kind of explicit climate change plan, it's got an implicit one. And that is made up of the possibly unspoken assumptions about emissions reduction and adverse climate impacts that underlie decision-making across your business. Every climate change plan, explicit or implicit, sits somewhere on that spectrum that Yasser mentioned, from let's do it all as fast as we can to let's don't do anything until we have to. And there's all sorts of reasons for having positions somewhere in between those two extremes. The only bad plan is a plan you haven't thought about, because that means you're not taking one of your top 5 risks seriously. So if we move to the next slide, in most sectors, most of a business's greenhouse gas emissions are related to the kinds of energy that it and its suppliers use. So a big part of your climate change plan is going to be about how you and your suppliers move towards less emissions intensive and preferably zero carbon in energy technologies. We'll call that your energy transition roadmap, and it needs to be as carefully thought through as the rest of your climate change plan, because if you have a disorderly energy transition, that's going to result in lost value. Let's move on again. So ignore what's on the slide for the moment, or just treat it as background. And instead, let's just think about a couple of hypothetical energy transition scenarios and the issues they could raise. Let's imagine first that I'm the general counsel of a company that imports into the EU lots of steel products, and those fall within the scope of the new EU Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, or CBAM. Currently, we produce these products from, we get them from a manufacturer in Asia. Their facilities have high greenhouse gas emissions. They pay no domestic carbon price. From 2026, under CBAM, we will have to pay EU carbon pricing on the emissions embedded in the steel we import when we import it. And that's going to push up our costs. So the business says, right, we're going to use this as an opportunity to pivot towards green procurement. And they've got a short list of 3 options for post-25 supply. Option 1 is another Asian steel maker it's offering the lowest price, and it says that it's going to be running on 100% renewable from 2025 because of a publicly upgraded, financed upgrade of the electricity network was going to connect it to a new wind farm. So we've got the benefits of a lower cost base without any liability for EU external carbon pricing. Unfortunately, our new green logistics policy means that we're going to use only ships with zero emission fuel from 2028, so the transport costs are going to go up. Option 2, we and 2 other companies have been invited to become anchor customers of a new EU-based, handsomely subsidized green steelworks. That's going to open in 2025. We'd need to commit to purchase all our steel requirements from the new plant for at least 5 years. Option 3, we switch to an EU-based steelmaker who's got an existing coal-fired blast furnace. For the 2026 and 2027, its prices are going to reflect EU internal carbon pricing, but after that, it's going to get fitted by new technology that removes at least 90% of all its CO2 emissions. Okay, that's steel. Let's now imagine another scenario. This time I'm working for a company with a large power demand. The CEO goes to COP28, signs a pledge to slash corporate emissions, comes back wanting to run on 100% renewable power globally within 3 years, preferably from new projects. Now, she wants us to be climate leaders in our sector and points out that given recent fossil fuel price volatility, this should benefit us economically. Here are options for getting renewable power in one of our facilities in 2025. Option 1, direct supply from an extension to an adjacent solar farm. They want us to take power for 10 years, make a down payment within 30 days on the long lead time items that our connection is going to require. The per unit power price will be fixed, indexed, subject to certain assumptions, and it's likely to be the cheapest offer, at least while current rules remain in place that mean that we pay no public grid charges and no environmental and social levy costs. Option 2, as a utility with power generation and supply businesses, offers us a regular energy retail contract, no need for new infrastructure, special deals. It's going to guarantee supply from its new wind farms. Prices set annually in line with wholesale market frameworks. Option 3, close to our facility, there's another developer with consents and rights to build a wind farm and associated infrastructure to protect the land from recently increased flood risk. The product is shovel ready. It's even got a government price support contract, but currently it's got no buyer for its power, and the developer is on the verge of bankruptcy. So the insolvency practitioners come to us and say, would you like to buy this project as part of a pre-pack rescue of the developer's business? It would generate more power than we need, but we can sell the excess to finance the purchase. Okay, so both these scenarios raise lots of regulatory issues. There's questions about subsidy control, antitrust, electricity market rules, carbon pricing, much, much more. If we go down a little bit further, you've got more issues about the contracts that would implement them, how to deal with the risks of new infrastructure not being completed on time or new technology not performing as expected, how to allocate the risks of changes in costs, including regulatory change, and so on. The scenarios are obviously exaggerated, but they're based on real life. In practice, a lot of your energy transition roadmaps are going to be based on trade-offs between the risks of taking or delaying action. And sometimes those are going to be different types of risks. You're going to have to weigh the certainty of higher costs of doing the green thing now against the possibility of, say, future litigation if you don't. And that makes the legal analysis of risks on either side very important. So the scenarios show you that many of the factors or risks that feed into your roadmap are bound up with what government does or doesn't do. And of course, the positions that governments take will feed into and be influenced by the outcomes of COP28. As we've seen, the presidency of COP28 has highlighted fast-tracking the energy transition as a priority. There may or may not be high-level declarations at COP28 about phasing out coal or other fossil fuels, but implementing those aspirations is going to be at least as much about action taken by businesses as it is by governments. And ultimately, the impact of everything that happens under the Paris Agreement is always about what action is taken by parties at national level. So if you operate in Nigeria, this year you've experienced what happens when a government just decides to abolish fossil fuel subsidies because it happens to have the political will and strength to do it at that moment. If you're an oil and gas company in the UK North Sea, the sector regulator is now telling you that within 7 years, you won't be allowed to produce from a new platform unless it runs entirely on greenhouse gas emissions-free power. And existing platforms with high operating emissions and low output are going to have to close. So there was a table on the previous slide showing how thinking about a climate change plan involved all areas of a business, and it didn't mention the legal function. That's because the legal input needs to be pervasive. Government action may help or hinder your energy transition initiatives. Either way, the contracts you sign are a key way of mitigating the risks or sharing the upsides connected with them. Planning your company's energy transition involves all sorts of analysis and disciplines, but the legal perspective on risk analysis and contractual management of risk is a central part of it. So what you need to know about COP28 is that as Corporate General Counsel, you have a key role to play both in navigating your business through the energy transition and saving society from catastrophic climate change.
Adam, thank you so much. I think in 10 minutes, that was like the energy transition for business 101 equivalent of splashing cold water on my face first thing in the morning. And, you know, I get it. So thank you very much for that. We're now going to move swiftly on to the last pillar of our discussion today, and that's climate finance. And over to Vivian.
Yes, now we have this hard question of who funds. And so I think in this session, I'll try and highlight that. I think the tension between government funding and as Stephen said at the outset, we probably not optimistic in terms of moving a lot along in terms of government commitment to funding. But I would highlight that the pressure within the private sector will continue. And so we look at the pressure on private sector, within private sector and on the private sector. So with that, we can start with the first slide, please. So taking a step back, in terms of the global stock take, I would emphasize that we're doing this in the context of the IPCC synthesis report earlier this year, which really highlights the urgency of climate action that we need deep and cumulative carbon emissions reductions across the entire economy, across all sectors, and we need to scale up mitigation adaptation efforts. And well, in summary, there has been elevated private sector response already. I think within the investment community, the key being the UNPRI Principles for Responsible Investment, there is an emphasis on having to respond to the elevated risks around climate and the inevitable policy response, the trigger effect of policy actions around climate. And the PRI has emphasized with respect to COP28 that this represents a significant and perhaps final opportunity for parties as well as non-state actors to scale up action to deliver on the Paris Agreement. So the PRI, through its members, which are large and global asset managers and across, will be putting pressure on companies and themselves under pressure. And an illustration of a sort of pressure within the private sector is also GFANZ. And GFANZ also illustrates the need to pay attention to updates around the private sector commitments that comes through COP each year. So COP26 was when GFANZ was formed, the Glasgow Financial Alliance of Net Zero, and GFANZ earlier this year has emphasized coal phase out and providing guidance in Asia Pacific, for example. And so with that, the next slide, please. So in terms of the global stock take, we also have the specific recognition and accountability framework for non-party stakeholders published earlier this year in June, and the Integrity Matters, which highlights the attention and implementation planned to scrutinize net zero pledges of non-state actors. So what all this means in sum is that we will continue to see pressure on the private sector on having credible net zero transition plan. So companies really need to take on board the need to transition business models and consider all those issues and the complexity of it, as Adam outlined in the earlier session. And a lot of companies have been using finance and we have the ICMA, which is the International Capital Markets Association, the Secretariat for the Green Bonds Principles and the Sustainability Linked Bond Principles, also publishing an updated climate transition finance handbook, where it highlights again the focus on the credibility of an issuer's greenhouse gas emissions reduction strategy and practices. And we have as well, in terms of regulations, the push for better sustainability reporting in the form of the global adoption of the Task Force for Climate Financial Disclosures in the form of the ISSB, which I'll cover briefly in the next couple of slides. So in terms of climate transition finance, going a little bit deeper is to highlight for general counsel especially to consider, because they have been used in the market. Green bonds and use of proceeds instruments, they have been used to finance green projects. And on the other hand, there has been emergence of more use of sustainability linked instruments. And both of these type of instruments under the climate transition focus will be under increased scrutiny, whether they are tied to a concrete overall transition plan of the corporate issuer. And so there is risk around, the commitments not being ambitious enough, or the KPIs tied to sustainability linked instruments really not being concrete enough. And so there's concerns of greenwashing, and also concerns of how financiers financing or investing into companies will be scrutinizing this. And these are issues that legal counsel should be involved and really paying attention to. Although at the same time, I think there is some help in terms of taxonomies that accept that the companies would have the sort of the pathway towards transition rather than not necessarily being greened at the moment, in contrast to the EU taxonomy, which focus on adaptation and mitigation. The Singapore taxonomy, for example, really recognized transition under its proposed taxonomy. So the next slide, please. Where I'll just highlight in terms of the sustainability reporting, which is published earlier this year, the ISSB standards S1 and S2, in particular S2, the climate-related disclosure standard, which really seek to introduce a global baseline under the IFRS. And it is intended to be really bring about a paradigm shift in corporate sustainability reporting, so that intention is that companies and countries adopt this, companies will be expected to produce sustainability reporting that assesses climate-related risks and opportunities on how the company's financial position, cash flows in the short term and medium and long term might be impacted by climate risk, and what kind of measuring target setting that companies would need to adopt in order to manage this risk and build resilience and perhaps identify opportunities. And so this should hopefully bring about a forward-looking and companies' strategic assessment of climate risks together with scenario analysis. So in other words, companies will kind of need to be more transparent in terms of whether they are paying attention to take those measures that Adam described in the earlier panel. And so this will really scrutinize corporate actions around climate, and these will also underline how investors assess companies when they are investing, and also banks when they are financing companies. So it links back to finance. So I think these are illustrating the pressure on private sector. So back to COP28 and how this will, how we look at this balance in the tension between public funding and private sector funding. The next slide, please. When we really still have this kind of idea of who funds and this concept of just transition. So the loss and damage fund, as Melissa mentioned earlier, there's still to be agreed how this will be arranged. Key questions like the sources of funding. Will we have more debt funding, or will there be grant funding, use of concessionary capital, and what sorts of governance arrangements would there be? Would there be equitable allocation of capital funding where it's most needed between the global north, the global south? And also this idea that will we be looking at how will we be approaching this nuance of holding or investing assets that are fossil fuel companies, and this idea of transition and not divestment, and what does that actually mean or will look like. And also about infrastructure development and technical assistance, which earlier speakers covered. How will we have access to technology when financing, and also in infrastructure development and finance, how would we kind of think about loss of livelihoods and empowering local communities? The emphasis really should be about how we have public and private partnerships and stakeholders. So it's really to be seen at COP28 whether we'll have a balance in terms of good progress between the government conversations, always hopeful, but pragmatic as well. Perhaps at the end of the day, there's still going to be a lot of pressure on the private sector, but the private sector is pushing back as well. So I can move to this next slide to finish. In terms of, while we have the expectation that GFANZ, IMF, and the World Bank will be focusing on private capital mobilization, I think within the private sector, there's already a lot of conversation in terms of the need for government funding support to push things along. And so there's actually been renewed emphasis on blended finance, which means the use of public capital, patient capital, concessionary capital to de-risk and catalyze additional private capital from institutional investors for infrastructure and development projects. So these are actually something that within the financial markets is in focus across, and we should be looking out for these themes coming out of COP. Thank you.
Thank you, Vivian. At the heart of what you were saying there about sustainable finance, I think that it was evident that there's an increased focus on the rigor around how people are performing and how that ties into the finance, and also the transparency around reporting on performance. And those two aspects are a very helpful segue into just this last section that I wanted to share with our listeners to draw together what you've heard today, because you've heard about the geopolitical context that COP28 is taking place in. You've heard what's going to be discussed at COP28 by the participants in the room. As Mel said, there is going to be a more inclusive COP than ever before. More voices will be heard, but at the heart of it, this is governments talking to governments about how to move forward and address climate change. And then we've gone into the perspectives from the Middle East, energy transition in a more business-focused context, and sustainable finance. But what is very important to understand, especially for general counsels and legal teams, is that there are a raft of stakeholders that are observing what is happening around companies' decarbonizations and climate change plans. And stakeholders are holding businesses to account in different ways. And this is where legal risk is really coming from in the broader ESG context. So think very much here about litigation risk. If we don't have a regulatory roadmap to follow in terms of how we're going to get to net zero in alignment with the Paris Agreement, consider the litigation that may follow against companies who are outwardly committing that they are aligned with the Paris Agreement. Now, I'm not necessarily just talking about NGO litigation here. Think about pension funds. Think about the broader investor base. These litigators are bringing companies and holding companies to account for those commitments around decarbonisation and net zero plans. So this is a growing risk for general counsels to keep vigilant of. Now, think about ratings agencies. They're watching what's happening. And increasingly, if you have a particular exposure within the company, a ratings agency may keep that on their books for a decade afterwards. So the carbon space is not a space that is immune from exposure just because projects are designed to decarbonize the supply chain. In the absence of global regulatory frameworks around carbon reduction, the offsets market is actually giving rise to a number of issues for companies at the moment, whether it be around the measurement of carbon sequestration, whether it be around the human rights involved in relation to workers on particular offset projects. But these are issues that the ratings agencies are taking note of, not just the sustainability criteria, but the overall impact of the business. Supply chain pressure is mounting. We've seen there is going to be a key discussion around technology and energy transition at COP28. But we are seeing laws evolving across the world and particularly in the European Union in relation to tracing back minerals, metals, components to source. So as we look at energy transition, it's not just about the effect of the technology that's being used. It's actually about understanding the social and environmental impacts of the components that are going along that supply chain. So businesses and general counsels need to be very vigilant of understanding those impacts across the supply chain. Also, think about a world in which geopolitical factors are preventing an ordered response to decarbonisation. This means that we're going to have, perhaps a process within which we move in a more spiky transition, where we're going to go through a period of perhaps less governmental input and then enhanced governmental input as we need to address certain issues more quickly. That can lead to stranded assets and lots of legal issues required to unpick your businesses from those positions. And the phrase double materiality. This is going to be the phrase that legal teams are going to become very used to through 2024. And this is a phrase really that is requiring business to understand both the business's impact on the contribution to greenhouse gases and the contribution to climate change. But the double materiality aspect is also the financial impacts on you of increasing adverse weather events, sea level rises, and actually understanding the financial impacts to your business of not moving along this transition. So there are a lot of legal factors and legal risks for legal teams to manage going forward, irrespective of whether we see COP28 as a success or a failure. So that brings us to the end of today's discussion. We've got 1 minute to go. All I would like to do at this stage is just highlight that there's a lot of materials available on the website for you to look and read more about. And also, of course, this is part of our ongoing client experience program. So keep your eyes open for the next webinars. Thank you, everyone, for attending and joining us today. Thank you very much to all of our speakers for the rich content and guidance that you've given.